Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 1st of February. I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, British use Australia to form Asian NATO for war with China. Governments who don't build flood infrastructure are criminally negligent. And election 2013. Voters can either swing like monkeys or support Glass-Steagall and a national bank. So first, British use Australia to form Asian NATO for war with China. Last week we had the 5th annual Australia-UK Ministerial Dialogue in Australia. It was held in Perth, and it was between the foreign ministers and the defence ministers of both countries. So William Hague, who's the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and Philip Hammond came to Australia. And what was striking was the entire tone of their visit, because everything they did, Craig, was targeted at China, with hand on their heart saying we're not targeting China.
Implicitly also Russia.
Implicitly also Russia. Specifically, we talked about a little bit of this last week. What we want to talk about today is the fact that, especially the Defence Secretary Philip Hammond, they urged Australia to deepen our cooperation with NATO, because NATO is seeking to become a worldwide force. Now, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and it was a purely defensive pact that formed during the Cold War, and it was the European-based defensive bulwark against Soviet communism. Right? That was NATO. And Craig, in our New Citizen newspaper that we printed in October, there's a speech in there by Malcolm Fraser where Malcolm Fraser made the point that after the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union fell, instead of the West reaching out to the former Soviet bloc for economic development to make the world a better place, NATO, he said, continued to act like the Cold War was still on and targeted Russia literally for destruction. Right?
Yeah, Robbie, at this particular time, we had proposals on the table. Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche specifically proposed what was called the productive triangle proposal, to actually take the industrial parts of Europe and, using spiral arms of development through infrastructure corridors, begin to redevelop Russia and the Eastern Bloc countries that were decimated through
East Germany, Poland, Ukraine, etc.
This was an opportunity, a golden opportunity for the West to turn its back on the Cold War era and have massive economic development in Europe. Instead, we got the looting of Russia through free trade policies pushed by organisations like the Montpellier Society.
British Crown organisations.
That's correct. And you got NATO, instead of being disbanded, was actually used as a battering ram against Russia. It began to encourage former Russian states federation states to come into USSR states, come into NATO, and it was used as a divide and conquer mechanism against Russia.
Well, they ran these, what's called the colour revolutions, which the George Soros outfit funded, in countries like Ukraine and Georgia. These are neighbouring Russia. And the purpose was to topple those governments so that those countries would be brought into NATO, and therefore Russia would find itself with its enemy right on its border. Yes. Right? And sane heads knew, like Fraser, like LaRouche, knew what was the implications of this were for destruction and war. Well, this is what they seek to replicate, Craig, in Asia against China. Now, the Chinese see this coming. And we quoted last week this Chinese colonel talking about the United States and Japan being the tiger and the wolf, and the Chinese hate the wolf the most. And they see that what's being built is an Asian NATO. What the Chinese don't really see very much, and what most people always miss, is the hand of the British. Yes. America's so big and so dominant, everyone thinks, oh, this is all American. Read the British's own words, it's them. America is their tool to achieve this, because what a British Empire means now is a global financial dictatorship run from the City of London and Wall Street, where nations have no sovereignty against that kind of financial power, and countries that are fiercely protective of their sovereignty, such as Russia now, in the wake of this looting of it, when Putin's come back to try and restore Russia, or China, which China's happy to trade with the world but is fiercely protective of its sovereignty, are not going to bow to this Anglo-American hegemony. So what we want to do is highlight the British role, because that's the key role. Unless people see that the British will get away with it. And unfortunately, Craig, in Asia, the British work through us. And I just want to go through the history of that. We are seeing the culmination of a strategy that was first unveiled in 1995, which our organisation blew the whistle on at the time. There was an event at Chatham House in London, and this was this is a conference called Britain and the World. This event was attended by members of the royal family, because all British strategy has to be signed off on by the royal family. And the purpose of this event was to unveil a new strategy in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union for Anglo-American hegemony, which only China stood in the way of. And so the focus of this was Asia. There was a paper delivered at this conference by an Australian, an academic named Catherine West, and it was called Discussion Paper Number 60, Economic Opportunities for Britain and the Commonwealth. And I'll just read the formulation of what we reported at the time. This paper called upon the London elites to make greater use of the Commonwealth nations for British economic and political power to encompass the Far East and Asia, calling on Britain to de-emphasise the financially exhausted European continent, which this week David Cameron just announced Britain will hold this referendum on withdrawing from the EU because it is financially exhausted. So this is part of it. This Catherine West paper urged a policy of, this is the term, quote, mutual exploitation between London and the far-flung capitals of the Commonwealth, beginning with Australia, which West characterised as a, quote, bridgehead into Asia. The drive to transform the Commonwealth into the core of a new British Empire, she wrote, stems from the, and here's her quote, the experience of empire and the dynamics of an informal financial empire that maintained its vibrancy long after the formal empire went into decline, end quote.
And we talk about a modern British Empire. For those sceptics who don't think the British Empire exists today, what they have just told us is how it works today.
This is in their own words. They do regard themselves as an informal financial empire, and that's their governing principle. Now, that was 1995. Since then, China hasn't wilted in the face of the strategy. Russia has actually become resurgent under Putin. So what you're seeing now is the emphasis on the strategy is very militaristic. And what we've been exposing for more than 12 months is LaRouche's warning that what's really happening is a drive for war. They are at the point where it's their side that collapsed, the transatlantic economies collapsed, and so the Brits, and using Obama, are saying, okay, we're not going to collapse while the Asian region stays dominant. We will blow them up before that happens, and they're determined to provoke a war with Russia and China. And so that is the context for what happened at this AUKMIN, the Australia-UK ministerial meeting in Perth last week. Australia and the UK signed a treaty called the Australia-United Kingdom Defence and Security Cooperation Treaty. What's stunning about this treaty is they described it as, in the words of the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, our Defence Minister, Stephen Smith, quote, provided for the first time an overarching strategic framework for our bilateral defence relationship. Given how close Australia and the Brits already are, to say that this provides that for the first time shows you how far they're actually taking it. And when I say how close, we mentioned here quite a few months ago, a description of how close was given by the Australian newspaper's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, a while ago. In 2007, he was writing a book called The Partnership. And he was describing, the partnership was about Australia and the United States. And he said when he was looking into this book, what stunned him had nothing to do with the United States. It's how close Australia was with Britain. He said everywhere I went in the Australia-US partnership, I found the Brits. That's a quote from Greg Sheridan. We're already very close. No two countries share intelligence as closely as Australia and Britain, right? So they've extended that even more. Then, just briefly, the elements of what the cooperation is about are exactly what we exposed and what we've just talked about. It's a commitment to George Soros-style open government operations, which constitute irregular warfare. This idea of encircling, toppling, using things like corruption scandals, etc., to build fake grassroots protest movements to topple governments that you can strategically identify adjacent to your target, namely China, like they did with Russia. And we'll put a map up on the screen that shows the colour revolutions encircling Russia, which they want to replicate. One of the things also that was a big topic of discussion at this meeting, Craig, was cooperation on cyber security. And then a few days later, Julia Gillard gave this speech. If people watch the news, on a major landmark defence speech, where her big emphasis was cyber security as well. The public probably think that cyber security means protecting websites from being hacked. The truth is, when they talk about cyber security, it means protecting the computer systems that operate the NATO-Obama ballistic missile defence system. And this is the system that we first exposed last May in the New Citizen, that the Russians and the Chinese have both said will be the trigger for war. This is a ballistic missile defence system targeted at Russia and China, which totally destabilises the world's strategic balance and will be the trigger for war. And when they're talking about cyber security, they want to protect those systems, because one thing Russians and Chinese are good at, Craig, is hacking.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of many things they're good at. So you see here the Brits and our government are doing their best to make war with China inevitable. My question for you, though, is it inevitable?
Well, Robbie, I think this brings back the issue of what Mr. LaRouche has been hitting in the United States. If Obama is out of the presidency, this isn't possible. If the United States has a change of policy such that it goes back to what actually the United States was under Roosevelt, forget it, the Brits have got no power. They can't push this policy.
Because they need to operate through American military might.
The giant with a clay head, I think someone referred to it as, right? And that's what you've got in America. Sometimes they act pretty dumb in the sense that they're nothing but tools for the British. I mean, here you have a country that fought American Revolution, was invaded in 1812 by the British specifically. This is the enemy, the historical enemy of the United States.
The British sided with the South in the Civil War to try and split America
and guess
up.
what the policy was? It was an economic policy of free trade, globalisation. The exact same policy we have ruining the world today was a policy that was fought against by those in the American Revolution, at that time under King George III. But look, the issue is get rid of Obama. Now, is that possible? Well, right, this last week there's been major breakthroughs. The appellate court in the United States has ruled that a lot of Obama's recess appointments were invalid, that you can't simply overrule the Constitution. They were very, very specific in a 47-page ruling. There's plenty of this information now on the website.
It undermined his claims to executive power.
The unitary executive, as they refer to, right? And there's a whole lot of very, very important breaking developments on this coming forward. So it's not the case that Obama is safe. I remember when Richard Nixon got elected before the Watergate scandal, he had a landslide victory of the electorate when he won back the presidency. He was out of office in about 8 months.
So if you can take that factor out of the equation, then this whole thing can fall over on itself.
And that's the point, is that this is not a fait accompli. And if you have a focus on economic development,
which is what the Chinese ambassador said last week.
Yeah.
We want economic development as the
Russia wants economic development. China wants economic development. There's cooperation between the two powers. We need economic development, as the floods have just shown in the last week. So, I mean, this is an impulse that the British are trying to stop from happening, and we're getting, they're trying to promote this war as quick as they possibly can.
Yep. All right, well, we've covered a bit there, Craig. For the sake of time, we better leave it. When we come back, we're going to talk about the flood crisis. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Governments who don't build flood infrastructure are criminally negligent. So, Craig, we've got a lot of chaos in Queensland because of these floods. I think the people of Australia are going to have in their mind a new metric, which they don't have already, for what a responsible government would do if it was being responsible. Because if we don't change the way we view the government's role, we're going to keep getting washed away.
I think, Robbie, people have got a rather shock now that in the space of 2 years we've had 2 massive floods in Queensland, and this is supposed to be 1 in a 100-year floods. This is statistical nonsense. The problem we've got is there's no commitment to stopping that which is already known to happen. And the problem we've got behind us is the fact that we're operating on a monetary system, and we do not have a system of government backed by national banking to be able to create the necessary infrastructure through creating the credit to solve these knowable problems. And because they're knowable problems, and they can be solved, maybe not 100% of everything, but you can greatly mitigate, for example, against the floods.
So you've done some work on Bundaberg.
Yeah, well, it's
to
a bit
prove
shocking
that they're knowable problems.
Yeah, well, look, I was concerned about actually getting the picture. Why does this keep happening? Is this something that is knowable, or is this something completely accident, or is this criminally negligent? And then I stumbled across this particular map.
Well, before you show them that picture, I just want to say, Bundaberg's my hometown of sorts. So it just struck me that there was a previous record, 1893. This one was higher, but a few centimetres higher, right? So they knew that floods could get to this scale.
Yes.
And what you've seen is how detailed was that knowledge.
Yeah, well, this is a map that's on the Bundaberg, the Bundaberg City Council website, right? And you can see the various colours. And it details in advance where the flood waters will come at various heights. And therefore, it's spatial data developed, geospatial data developed for the purpose of being able to predict where the damage is going to occur.
And it plotted to 11 metres. So what we're dealing with is we've got to 9.5 metres.
Yeah. Now, what's the point? Now, I went back and looked at Engineers Australia, which is made up of, I think, 100,000 of our engineers in Australia. And they make the point that there is not really any state-based, or for that matter, federally based capability for local councils, other than those that wish to put a lot of money into this sort of mapping, to actually grid out the sort of flood levels that are involved when you're talking about floods. In other words, what they're saying is, if you want to mitigate floods, there's different ways of doing it. First of all, you can build dams, right? But flood mitigation dams are different than water storage dams. Yep. Like, you would need to, my looking at this is, you would try and keep the dams at between 50 and 60% full at all times. Therefore, you'd use hydroelectricity to feed off the water, but you'd keep them 50 to 60% full so that you had this capacity to absorb large flows of water. So you'd have a continuous release of water right through the entire system, like in the Burnett system, for example. They built the Paradise Dam. They only built it to a fraction of the size they could have, but it was built as a water storage dam, not a flood mitigation dam. Now, if you were to build these dams, and a lot more of them with the view of mitigating floods, then you can reduce the water flows that come through places like Bundaberg. So you're not going to necessarily stop a flood, but you could maybe stop the flood at 6.5 metres. Then you can build various levee banks and infrastructure to say, okay, we're going to have a 6.5 metre flood, which would be the equivalent of a 9 metre flood if we didn't have the dams. And all of this can be done through the sort of engineering capabilities that we already have.
Yeah, the engineering is not the issue, it's the intention. And if there's an intention, the next hiccup will be the financing.
That's what I said. Look, the point is, if the intention is to stop floods, then you have to deal with the finances. Local councils don't have the means to do this, right? You have to look at this from the federal level top down. You have to do it through the creation of a national bank that creates the credit, and we're talking billions of dollars here. I mean, they were skirting in Queensland about the $40 million that Campbell Newman's put up for flood mitigation. I mean, what a joke. It'd be more like $4 billion when you talk about, waterproofing the roads, lifting them up so they don't get cut. Talking about all the levee banks that could be built, the actual recording of the spatial data necessary to map floods. All these sorts of things, the hard infrastructure for building dams, the soft infrastructure to know and to model how these floods would occur, are all the issues that have to be funded. So you're talking about the necessity for, like a military operation, funded properly top down from credit. And that credit would be an investment in the future so that you don't have these huge wastages and destruction of property into the future.
Yep.
And it's going to be known that these floods happen again and again and again. So if you're smart and not criminally negligent, you say, okay, well, let's stop this. Let's do what has to be done for the benefit of the future generations.
All right, thanks for that, Craig. Now, when we come back, we have to talk about the surprise election call, which we'll do after the break. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, election 2013. Voters can swing like monkeys or support Glass-Steagall and a national bank. So, Craig, the Prime Minister's pulled a Swiftie, got everyone surprised, which is interesting in politics. That's not the bigger deal, though. We want to talk about the timing. The issue is this: the media for the next 6 months is going to demoralise the public into thinking there's only two choices. What is the CEC's approach going to be to this election?
Well, we're going to try and save the bananas for the monkeys, Robbie.
Okay.
Because what we're going to try and do is put in a system that doesn't cause the sorts of damage necessary to wreck the economy. Like, we lost a lot of bananas in Cyclone Yasi, right? Right now, that may have been unpreventable, but the point is that unless you change the economic system, unless you change the banking system, there is no future for this country. We can't be independent. There is no future. You know, we're locked into a slave-based economy of free trade and globalisation.
You don't think Abbott's going to change it?
Oh, yin and yang, Robbie. You talk about monkeys. The monkeys will run from one side to the other depending on who offers them the best bananas.
I mean, it's easy for us to badmouth Abbott and Gillard, but the onus here is really on the voter, though, right?
Well, look, the issue is, do you want a future? Right? Are we going to develop this country, or are we going to die out on the policies of free trade, which is what we've done in a resolution recently we've been campaigning on. Look, the solution globally is for a Glass-Steagall. We have to take control of the global banking system that's bankrupt right now, which means going back to policies that worked. The Glass-Steagall in 1933 effectively separated out the gambling component of the banking system back then with a legitimate commercial banking system, then re-regulated the entire banking system to say, you will be banks, you will fund the economy, you will fund the commercial nature of our economy, and the federal government will actually support that. So we're talking about the breakup of banks, in effect, into smaller units which are not funded by taxpayer bailouts. That's the first thing, but it's not the only thing. You can't just have a banking system fixed up. You have to have a contention to develop the country, which is what the Labor and Liberal Party don't have, Robbie. They have a commitment to globalisation, to free trade, and the sort of policies that are pushing us into
and balanced budgets. That's all they're talking about, is who's going to balance the budget.
Well, who cares? The point is, if you've got an intention to develop the nation, you have to have a credit system, a system of finance that creates the money, or in this form of credit, to say we want to have at the end of 20 years large-scale water projects, large-scale infrastructure development projects which will employ more people but increase the physical capacity of our economy. We want to do that. And you have that intention, you fund it through credit, and through the expansion of the economy, the increases in taxes and so forth, you develop the economy. So what I'm talking about is a commitment to large-scale infrastructure development, the sort of infrastructure that would save people from floods. Imagine how many people you could employ, engineers and others, just in flood mitigation projects alone. More flood mitigation dams, more levee banks, right? The sorts of programs right round all those known areas. You take, for example, the Clarence River. You know, we just put a press release out, not one more drop, attacking the members of Parliament that were opposed to actually building dams on the Clarence River. I mean, here you have an enormous volume of water, and we're talking about taking a smidgen of that water, right, and building dams that potentially could stop the flood of those particular areas. And that's the sort of things we have to talk about.
Australians get demoralised, though, and say, sounds good, but it'll never happen.
That's why they have to join. That's why they have to join us, Robbie. People are going to sit on their couches and say, and bemoan Gillard and Abbott. Well, serves them right. Get off their butts, join us, campaign with us, have some fun, and talk about the future for our country.
Well, you've been told. So that's it for this week's edition of the CEC Report. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.